need you to take your hands off of that. And I said, I'm not going to do it. She said, take your hands off or I'm going to send you to the office. And then I'm thinking through how this, like, is it better to do this or is it better to get sent to the office? So I just took the lesser of the two evils and I just took my hand off about the time she leaned over. And it literally shot up, knocked her glasses off, and removed a ceiling tile. Right? Isn't that a metaphor for what happens when we panic? Like, we just make it worse. If I'd have just left my hand off of it and let it do its thing, I would have gotten a little bit of trouble. We'd have cleaned up the mess, and it would have been over. Instead, I'm panicking and trying to do something else with it. This is what Ahaz's problem is. He's panicking. He thinks we're going to be destroyed by these two lesser kingdoms. So I've got to somehow bring in somebody else to help. And here's what Isaiah says. Isaiah says, God says through Isaiah, ask a sign from the Lord your God. Make it as deep as the grave or as high as heaven. So what is the thing here? God says, just ask for a sign. Ask me to prove it. Now, this is interesting because in the Torah, there's this whole thing about not putting God to test. Right? Not saying prove it. But in this case, Isaiah's like, forget that part. Just go ahead and ask God for a sign. It can be anything in the world. As deep as the grave or as high as heaven. You ask God, God will give you the sign. And Ahaz now is like the bastion of propriety and holiness. He says, I won't ask. I won't test the Lord. It's in the Bible. Like, that's probably what he's thinking. Isaiah said, listen, house of David, isn't it enough for you to be tiresome for people that you are also tiresome before my God? Therefore, the Lord will give you a sign. Like, you don't want to ask God for a sign? Okay, God's just going to give you a sign. The young woman is pregnant and about to give birth to a son, and she will name him Immanuel. Okay, you're not going to ask God for a sign? Okay, God's going to give you a sign anyway. There's a young woman. She's pregnant, and she's going to give birth to a baby, and that baby is going to be proof that God is with you. Which is an interesting, like, who's the baby? Like, every impulse in your being wants to say Jesus right now, doesn't it? But would that make sense to Ahaz hundreds of years before? Hey, after you're dead for a few hundred years, there's going to be a baby born. It's like, okay, Einstein, I'm pretty sure that happens all the time, right? So this is not something about the future for Ahaz. This is Isaiah saying to Ahaz, God speaking through the prophet, saying, right now, there's a young woman who's going to become pregnant, and she's going to give birth to a child, and that child is going to be proof that God is with you. Who would the child be? So some people think it might be Isaiah's wife, that Isaiah's, like, sometimes the prophets would take on these prophetic street theater things, like Hosea married a prostitute, for example, right? Ezekiel, I think it's Ezekiel who cooked bread over human excrement. Don't go to dinner at his house. And Isaiah later walks around naked for 3 years, which is a total commitment to the role you've been given. Right, so they would do these things. Jesus cleansed the temple, right? Like, prophets do these things. But most scholars don't think that it was actually Isaiah's wife that was pregnant. Most scholars think that the woman who's becoming pregnant is the wife of King Ahaz. And the baby that would be born from her was a man named Hezekiah. How many of you have heard of Hezekiah? Hezekiah, while very few kings in the book of Kings are said to be good and faithful people, Hezekiah is one of the few who is good and faithful, and he only worships Yahweh. He's like one of the ideal kings in the Old Testament. Right? That's who Hezekiah is. So let's think this through. Why might this be a sign to Ahaz? That his wife's going to have a baby, and that baby is going to be, how's that baby proof that God is with him? God had promised David that there would always be a descendant of David on the throne of Judah, right? Always. What does it mean when the king has a child born? What's going to continue? His reign. Which means, Isaiah is saying, if you'll be patient and you won't go asking for help, your dynasty will continue. You have a promise from God that a descendant of yours will always be on the throne. You don't have to scheme for it. You don't have to do back channel with Assyria for it. All you have to do is nothing. And sometimes nothing is the hardest thing to do. And Ahaz doesn't listen. Ahaz appeals to Assyria. They come in. They make Judah a vassal, which means they don't completely take over, but they take enough control that they can have whatever they produce. They have to pay yearly tributes. They still have their own king, but it's sort of a puppet situation. Assyria is really in charge. Now, they do go on and they wipe out Israel and they wipe out Aram. Like completely wipe out, done, destroyed. But Ahaz essentially brings this on his own people because in a moment of difficulty, he chooses to panic. He chooses to act with reaction. He doesn't choose to be calm and think through the process and think through the steps. He's afraid, and in his fear, he just reacts. Right? There's fight, flight, or freeze. Right? When you're confronted, you either fight, or you run away, or you just stand there. And Hezekiah did some sort of weird combination of fight and flight. Right? Where he doesn't do the right thing. And this is the story that Matthew references. It's a story that this child who was born to Ahaz, his son, would be flesh and blood proof that God was faithfully with them. There's a new generation being born to take the throne. Which raises the question, I'd love to hear from you if you have any ideas. Why would Matthew choose this particular story and text to quote? I mean, when you quote somebody in your writing, if you ever had written a paper in school, for example, you quote somebody, you do it for a reason, right? You do it to solidify your case or to prove a point. What might Matthew be doing with this story? Does anybody have any guesses? I don't have any sermon left, so you guys have got to do something. Yeah, so it's a way of saying, just like then, when this birth of this baby was flesh and blood proof that God was with us, like there's going to be a new baby born, and that baby's going to be in such a similar role. Yeah, and I'm going to talk a little about that in a second.
They would have been familiar with this story.
Right. This was a familiar story from their history, a story of a time when somebody didn't listen and didn't receive the sign, and instead went the other way. I think what we have to understand is the time that Matthew is written in, it's written maybe a decade after the Jewish people had been defeated by the Romans in the War of 70, or 66 to 70, where they revolted against Rome. They believed that violence was the way to win their freedom, and so they started killing Romans, and then the Romans showed up and razed the city to the ground and just completely disrupted, tore down the temple and everything else, and they lost essentially their entire way of life, right? It's almost like what we're being told in the story is you can be reactionary and you can think that you can kill your way to peace with the Romans. You think you can actually win, or you can trust this baby because this baby is going to show you the way. This baby is going to show you the way to freedom. This baby is going to show you the way to peace. This baby is hope that it doesn't actually have to go that way. And in Matthew's case, he's writing after it, so it didn't have to go that way, and it doesn't have to go that way again. Does that make sense? I think in some ways, Jesus, this is a story saying, are you going to be like Ahaz and panic and react, or are you going to accept the sign Ahaz wouldn't? I mean, think about the situation Joseph's in here, where his betrothed becomes pregnant. Right? I mean, in this culture, in this day, this is a scandal. And Joseph's initial impulse was to what? Panic. I'm gonna have to put this woman away, which is the literal rendering of the language. I'm gonna have to put her away. I'm gonna have to get rid of her. She's gonna be a big social drag. They're gonna call us all sorts of things. One of the term for Jesus would have been he was a mamzer in Hebrew, which means somebody born with questionable paternity. This follows Jesus' his entire life. There's actually a line, I think, in Mark where it says something like, we know who our father is, Jesus, right? So it's sort of, this whole question of paternity follows Jesus' his entire life. And the question for Joseph is, are you going to panic? Or are you going to help bring into the world this alternative way? Are you going to bring into the world this hope? That's what the Jesus story is about too, right? It's about trusting God in the kingdom of God in the face of a cross. wasn't Assyria staring down the people in Jesus' day. It was the Romans. And Jesus ends up dying on a Roman cross. And he has this trust that he's willing to go to the cross because God will not abandon him at the cross. Right? Even though it feels like God's abandoned him. He has this confidence that he's not going to be abandoned. That's the story of Jesus. I mean, it's the story of, will you embrace something that's difficult or will you run from it? And then I would put it like this. I think what Matthew's saying, to Randall's point, is Jesus is flesh and blood proof that God is still with us and still at work to transform and heal the world. That's what I think the story's getting at, is just as God was with them, God is with us. And we live in a world right now that needs hope. A world that needs this hope that tomorrow can actually be better, that we haven't peaked as a species, that there's more, that we can become better people, that we can be transformed, that the dream that Jesus spoke about, that the prophets spoke about before him, then the people have spoken about after him, that this dream of a renewed and transformed world where lion lays down with a lamb, where swords are beaten into plowshares, where we don't hate each other and we don't have vitriol, like that world is possible. What Matthew is saying is there's a baby being born, and anything's possible because this baby's being born. And then, for us, in this Advent season, we're faced with the question, how will we participate in the process of bringing Christ into the world? How will we announce the good news of this baby's birth? Will we do it by living in ways that are congruent with the life this baby grew up to live? Will we live it in ways that are congruent to following Jesus? How many of you have learned this? Following Jesus is tough. Right? Anybody learn this? I'm not talking about believing a set of things to get an afterlife experience. I'm talking about actually following Jesus, actually trying to love your enemies. That's a lovely idea, isn't it? C.S. Lewis said, forgiveness is a lovely idea until you actually have something that needs to be forgiven. It's easy to look at somebody else and say, forgive. But when it's you, it's really difficult. I mean, this Jesus way is difficult. And we have to choose whether we're going to retreat into fear and panic. Fear about our neighbor, fear of the stranger, fear, panic. And what we do when we panic is we just try to protect number one. Right? It's that great episode of Seinfeld where the kitchen catches on fire and George knocks down the women and children to get out. If you haven't seen it, where you been? But, right? I mean, it's that sort of fear and panic that drives the world right now. Turn on the news. What do you get? Fear and panic. Pick up a newspaper. What do you get? Fear and panic. Talk to your neighbor. What do you get? Fear and panic. What does it look like to be a people of hope in a world that's going crazy with fear and panic? What does it look like to be a person of hope that says, you know what? It looks rough, but it's not over. It looks hard. It looks difficult. It looks like a challenge. It looks like somebody's going to have to roll up their sleeves, put a little elbow grease into it. But it's not over. And then it comes down to our stories personally, right? Because the personal matters. We need the gift of hope this Advent for our own lives. That today and tomorrow, that tomorrow doesn't have to be defined by today, and it's not an endless loop of today's, and it's not an endless loop of our past. How many of us walk around with guilt all the time because of something we've not done or something we have done? And Advent is saying there's hope. You don't have to carry that around. Something new is being born, and you get to help bring it into the world. Something new is happening. Grace is happening. God is opening up the doors of the kingdom to every single human being. And whatever you're struggling with or going through, and however painful and difficult it may be, it does not have to be the end, and it does not have to define you. Because there's a baby on the way. And that baby grows up. You know, Will Ferrell didn't know that in Talladega Nights, where he's praying to sweet baby Jesus. Jesus grew up. And he became this human life that shows us what it looks like to embody God to the world. I want to close with this quote from Meister Eckhart that we began with. What good is it to me if Mary gave birth to the Son of God hundreds of years ago, thousands for us, if I do not give birth to the Son of God in my time and my culture? We are all meant to be mothers of God, for God is always needing to be born. How will God be born